and pointed across the pen. The late afternoon sun burned low over the plains, turning the whole spread into a picture of fire and shadow. He rested one boot on the bottom rail, narrowed his eyes, and said in a voice steady as the land itself, "I will take all these horses." The words hung in the air like a dare. Men standing nearby let out short laughs. They thought it was just talk, but the rancher did not laugh. He kept his gaze fixed on the herd, and on one horse in particular that stood apart from the rest. The auction yard had been noisy all day. Buyers called out prices, ranch hands moved cattle through gates, and the smell of hay and leather drifted through the breeze. It was the kind of place where deals were made quick and forgotten even quicker. Folks came to buy strong stock, not trouble. And those horses, standing tight together inside the iron fencing, were said to be trouble. They had been brought in from rough country. Wild-blooded, hard-headed, not fully broken. Some said they were useless. Others said they were cursed. A few claimed the herd had thrown more riders than any string in the county. So when the rancher announced he would take them all, every last one, people turned their heads. He was not the biggest man in the yard, nor the loudest. His coat was worn from years of weather, his hat stained with sweat and sun. His beard showed more gray than brown. But there was something in the way he stood, shoulders square and jaw set, that made a man think twice before crossing him. He had worked land most would not dare touch. He had built fences where storms had torn them down. And he had buried more than one dream in the hard soil of the West. Still, he kept going. The seller wiped his hands on his vest and stepped closer. "All of them?" he asked, as if giving the rancher one last chance to back away. "All of them," the rancher repeated. A murmur spread through the small crowd. A younger cowboy leaned over the fence and shook his head. "You will regret that," he muttered. The rancher did not answer. He was watching the horses move. Most of them paced and tossed their heads, ears pinned, eyes wide with distrust. Their coats shone under the dust, muscles tight and ready to bolt at the slightest noise. But one horse did not move much at all. It was a dark bay, tall and proud, with a white streak running down its face like a bolt of lightning. It stood still while the others circled. Its ears flicked back and forth, taking in every sound. Its eyes were sharp, not wild but aware. There was something steady in that gaze, something that did not match the restless shifting of the herd. "That one there," the rancher said quietly, nodding toward the dark bay. The seller followed his look and gave a short laugh. "That is the worst of them. Strong as a storm and twice as mean. No one has stayed on him longer than a breath." The rancher's eyes did not leave the horse. "Sometimes the strongest fight because no one ever gave them a reason not to," the seller frowned. "You think you can fix him?" The rancher did not answer that either. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded check. The paper had been carried a long way, edges soft from handling. He had thought hard before coming here. His own ranch was not thriving. The drought had taken a toll on his pasture. Feed prices were rising. Some folks said he should sell off what little he had left and move east. But he had stayed. He always stayed. He handed over the check without another word. By the time the sun dipped lower, the deal was done. The herd would be driven to his ranch at first light. As the crowd thinned, a few men lingered, watching him with doubt written plain on their faces. "You always did have a stubborn streak," one of them said. "But this is not stubborn. This is foolish." The rancher leaned against the fence and looked out at the land stretching beyond the yard. Rolling hills faded into purple distance. The wind carried the smell of sage. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it is time someone believed in them." Night settled slow and cool. Stars began to show themselves, scattered across the sky like silver nails. The horses quieted some, though the dark bay still stood apart. The rancher did not leave right away. He walked along the outside of the pen, boots crunching in the dirt, speaking low so only the animals could hear. He had grown up around horses. His father had taught him that a horse could feel a man's fear before the man knew it himself. He had learned patience the hard way, thrown into dust more times than he cared to count. But he had also learned that trust, once earned, was stronger than any rope. He stopped when he reached the dark bay. For a long moment, man and horse simply looked at each other through the bars. The horse's nostrils flared. Its muscles tensed. "You do not belong behind a fence," the rancher said softly. The horse stamped once, a sharp sound against the quiet. "Neither do I," he added. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The sound echoed across the open ground. The rancher rested his hand on the top rail, close enough that the horse could see but not touch. He did not reach out. Not yet. At dawn the drive began. Dust rose again as the gates swung open. The herd poured out like a river breaking free. Ranch hands on borrowed mounts guided them down the road toward open range. The rancher rode at the rear, keeping his eyes on stragglers. The dark bay stayed near the center at first, head high, watching everything. But halfway through the journey, something shifted. A gust of wind rattled a loose sign on an old post. The sharp clatter split the air. Several horses jumped sideways. The dark bay spun, striking out with a rear hoof. The herd began to scatter. "Easy," the rancher called, urging his mount forward. But the panic spread fast. Hooves pounded. Dust thickened. One of the younger hands lost control and veered off. The dark bay broke free from the cluster and bolted toward a narrow cut between two rocky hills. The rancher's heart slammed in his chest. If that horse reached the open canyon beyond, it could vanish for good, and the rest might follow. He dug his heels into his own horse and gave chase. Wind tore at his hat as he rode. The ground grew rough, stones flashing beneath pounding hooves. He could see the dark bay ahead, muscles stretching, mane flying like a banner. It was fast, faster than any horse he had seen in years. "Slow down," he muttered, though the words were lost in the rush of air. The cut between the hills narrowed. Jagged rocks lined the path. One wrong step could mean a broken leg, maybe worse. The rancher leaned low over his saddle, urging his mount on, closing the distance little by little. Then the dark bay did something no one expected. Just before reaching the narrowest point, it slowed. Not by much, not enough for safety, but enough to turn its head. It looked back. Its eyes locked onto the rancher's. In that split second, the world seemed to hold still. Dust hung in the air. The sound of hooves faded behind the pounding of blood in his ears. There was no fear in the horse's gaze now. No blind panic. There was something else, a question, or a challenge. The rancher eased his reins just a touch. He did not shout. He did not wave his arms. He simply held the horse's gaze and let his own fear settle. The dark bay slowed another stride. Behind them, the rest of the herd thundered closer. If they all funneled into that narrow cut at once, chaos would follow. The rancher knew it. The horse seemed to know it too. For one long breath, they faced each other across the space of dust and doubt. Then the dark bay turned sharply, not toward the canyon, but back toward the open trail. It ran straight at the rancher. Everything inside him braced. His mount sidestepped, uneasy. The dark bay came on, powerful and sure, closing the gap with each pounding stride. The other horses began to follow its lead, slowing, turning. The rancher held steady. 10 yards, 5, the dark bay did not lower its head. It did not bare its teeth. It ran straight and true, eyes fixed on him. And just when it seemed there would be no stopping the collision, the horse veered at the last instant, circling wide around him, driving the rest of the herd back toward the open plain as if it had chosen to lead them. The rancho twisted in his saddle, watching in disbelief as the scattered horses gathered behind the dark bay, falling into line. Dust rolled over the hills. The narrow cut stood empty. The rancher's breath came slow and heavy. He had expected a fight. He had expected weeks, maybe months, of broken fences and bruised ribs. He had not expected this. The dark bay slowed to a trot, then a walk, guiding the herd back to the main trail. It did not look back again. The rancher felt something shift inside his chest, something he had not felt in years. Not since the early days when he had first believed that hard work and steady hands could shape the wild into something strong and good. He turned his horse and followed. As they reached open ground once more, the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows behind them. The other hands stared in silence, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The rancher kept his eyes on the dark bay. He had said he would take all these horses. He had meant it as a promise to himself as much as to anyone else. But now he wondered if, in some way he did not yet understand, one of those horses had just taken him. And as the herd moved forward across the wide American plains, steady and united, the dark bay lifted its head once more. Ears pricked toward the distant horizon, as if it sensed something waiting there. Something neither man nor horse could see yet. The herd moved like a dark wave across the open range, dust rising behind them in a long trail that could be seen for miles. The rancher kept his distance, letting the dark bay hold the front. He did not push, he did not shout. He only watched. Something had changed in that narrow pass between the hills. He felt it in his bones the way a man feels a storm before the clouds roll in. The younger hands rode quieter now. The joking had stopped. Even the most doubtful among them had seen what happened. A wild horse did not turn back on its own. A wild horse did not gather a scattered herd and guide them steady as a seasoned lead. Yet that was exactly what the dark bay had done. By the time they reached the ranch gates, the sun stood high and hard above them. The land here was rough, but honest. Rolling pasture stretched toward a line of cottonwoods near a dry creek bed. The barns stood weathered and strong, boards silvered by years of wind. Fences ran long and straight, though some posts leaned tired from last winter's storms. The rancher rode ahead and swung open the main gate. The herd flowed through, hooves drumming against packed dirt. He had cleared the north pasture for them, a wide piece of land with good grass still holding on despite the dry season. It was not perfect, but it was enough. Once inside, the horses slowed on their own. They spread out, heads dropping to test the grass. A few still tossed their heads, nervous from the long drive. But the dark bay remained near the center, watchful, steady. The rancher dismounted slowly. His legs felt stiff from the ride. He handed his reins to one of the hands and walked toward the fence line, resting his arms across the top rail. He studied the herd the way a man studies a puzzle he intends to solve. "You got lucky," one of the older cowboys said behind him. "That horse could have run clear to the next county." "Maybe," the rancher replied. "You thinking of breaking him first?" The rancher shook his head. "No," the cowboy frowned. "Then what?" "I am thinking of letting him be." That answer did not satisfy anyone. Around here, horses were broken, trained, put to work. That was the order of things. A ranch survived on discipline and routine. Feed had to be hauled, cattle had to be driven. There was no room for guessing games, but the rancher was not guessing. Not entirely. He had not told the others the full truth about why he bought the herd. It was not just about needing fresh stock. It was not just about pride. Months ago, before the drought tightened its grip, he had lost his best lead horse. An old roan that had worked beside him for nearly 15 years? That loss had cut deeper than he let on. Since then, the ranch had felt off balance, like a wheel missing a spoke. He had come to the auction hoping for something he could not quite name. Strength, maybe, or spirit. When he saw the dark bay standing apart, not wild with fear, but sharp with awareness, something inside him stirred. It reminded him of that old roan, not in looks but in presence. Still, he could not shake the memory of how fast that horse had moved in the canyon, how close it had come to vanishing. That evening, after the hands finished watering the herd and checking the fences, the rancher walked back to the north pasture alone. The air cooled as the sun slipped low again. Crickets began their steady rhythm in the grass. The herd had settled. Most of the horses grazed or stood hip-shot, resting. The dark bay stood near the far side of the pasture, not grazing but watching the tree line beyond the fence. The rancher followed its gaze. The cottonwoods stirred gently in the breeze. Nothing seemed out of place. Still, the horse's ears stayed fixed forward. He leaned against a fence post and spoke low. "What do you see out there?" The horse flicked an ear but did not turn its head. The rancher stayed a long time. He watched the herd settle deeper into the evening calm. He watched the dark bay finally lower its head to graze, though even then it lifted it often, scanning the horizon. Over the next few days, the ranch fell into a new rhythm. The hands repaired weak sections of fence and set up a separate pen closer to the barn. The plan was simple enough. Start working with a few of the calmer horses first. Let them grow used to halters and ropes. Build trust slow and steady. The rancher joined in, but his mind often drifted back to the dark bay. Each morning he rode out early before the others stirred. the sky would still be pale, streaked with soft color as the sun prepared to rise. He would stop near the north pasture and watch the herd wake. The dark bay always woke first. It would lift its head, test the air, then move in a slow circle around the group as if counting them. It did not act like a brute. It did not bully the others, yet when it moved, the herd shifted with it. If it stepped toward the creek, several followed. If it paused, they paused. "You are no ordinary horse," the rancher muttered one morning. Later that week, something else happened. A storm rolled in without much warning. The sky darkened fast, wind sweeping across the plains with sharp force. The rancher and his hands hurried to secure loose tools and shut the barn doors tight. Thunder cracked overhead, sudden and loud. Lightning struck somewhere beyond the hills. Rain followed, heavy and cold. Storms were not new to this land, but this one carried a strange edge. The wind howled through the cottonwoods, bending branches low. The north fence rattled under pressure. The rancher pulled on his coat and rode out despite the rain. He had learned long ago that storms were when animals needed watching most. Panic could spread faster than fire. When he reached the pasture, he expected chaos. Instead, he found the herd gathered close together near the center of the field. Heads low, bodies pressed tight against the wind. And at the front, facing into the storm, stood the dark bay. Rain streamed down its coat, its mane whipped against its neck, but it did not move. It stood firm, as if holding the line against the gale. The rancher felt a strange mix of pride and unease. Horses did not choose to face storms head-on. They turned away, sought shelter, yet this one stood as if guarding something. Another bolt of lightning split the sky. For a moment, the entire pasture lit up bright as day. In that flash, the rancher saw something beyond the far fence, a shape moving near the tree line. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. Maybe it was only shadow. Maybe a stray branch thrown by wind, but the dark bay reacted. It let out a sharp, cutting whinny and pawed the ground once. The herd shifted nervously. The rancher narrowed his eyes against the rain. He rode closer to the fence, scanning the trees. The wind made it hard to see. Branches swayed wildly, leaves tore free and scattered. There it was again, a flicker of motion near the creek bed. He felt his grip tighten on the reins. Predators were not unheard of in these parts. A hungry animal driven down from higher country could cause trouble, but this felt different. The dark bay was not reacting with blind fear. It was alert, focused. The storm eased after an hour, rain tapering to a soft drizzle. The sky lightened slowly. The rancher stayed until he was sure the herd had settled again. Only then did he ride back toward the house. That night he lay awake longer than usual. The sound of wind still seemed to echo in his ears. He thought about the shape near the tree line. He thought about the dark bay standing firm against the storm. And he thought about the way that horse had looked at him in the canyon as if measuring him. The next morning he rode out early again. The pasture looked calm, washed clean by rain. Grass bent heavy with water. The herd grazed quietly. But when he reached the north fence near the creek, his stomach tightened. One of the fence posts had been snapped clean through, not by wind alone. The break was low and angled. Fresh, he dismounted and crouched beside it. The ground nearby was churned up, hoofprints mixed with something else, tracks leading toward the trees. He stood slowly, scanning the pasture. All the horses were still inside. The dark bay stood a short distance away, watching him closely. "You kept them in," he said under his breath. The broken fence could have been chance, a weak post giving way under pressure, but the tracks beyond it told another story. Something had come close in the night, close enough to test the boundary. The rancher straightened and met the dark bay's gaze. The horse did not look away. For the first time, the rancher felt certain of one thing. He had not only bought a herd of wild horses. He had stepped into something larger, something tied to this land and whatever moved along its edges after dark. And as the morning sun climbed higher, warming the wet earth, the dark bay turned its head once more toward the cottonwoods, ears sharp, body tense. Whatever had watched from the trees was not gone. The rancher did not mention the broken fence right away. He fixed it himself before the hands finished breakfast, setting a new post deep and firm into the damp earth. He He worked in silence, though his mind kept circling back to the tracks near the creek. They were not like the clean, sharp prints of a horse. They were lighter, narrow at the front, and spaced with careful distance. Whatever had come close to the pasture had not rushed. It had moved with purpose. By mid-morning, word had already spread that something felt off. One of the younger hands swore he heard a strange call during the storm, not thunder and not coyote either. Another said the cattle in the south field had been restless through the night, bunching together near the far fence. The ranch had seen dry seasons, harsh winters, and even the occasional stray predator drifting through. But this felt like the start of something drawn out. The rancher called the men together near the barn. He kept his tone calm. "We strengthen every fence line today. Double-check the creek side, no gaps. No loose wire? You think something is coming through?" One asked. "I think something is testing us," he replied. That answer settled heavy in the air. While the others worked, the rancher rode out alone along the property line. The land rolled uneven beyond the creek, rising into rocky hills dotted with brush. It was open country, the kind where a man could disappear if he chose to. He studied the tree line carefully. The cottonwoods still dripped from last night's rain. Birds called out as if nothing had changed. Yet he felt watched. He dismounted near the spot where the tracks had led beyond the broken post. He followed them on foot this time. They were faint now in the drying soil, but he could still make out the direction. They wound along the creek bed and then faded into the rocky stretch beyond. He stood there a long moment, hat low over his eyes, listening. The wind moved soft through the brush. Somewhere farther up the ridge, a loose stone tumbled. He did not chase the tracks farther. A rancher could not afford to wander too far from his herd. But he marked the place in his mind. Back at the pasture, the dark bay paced near the fence. It did not run, it did not spook. It simply moved in a steady line along the boundary, stopping now and then to lift its head toward the hills. The rancher leaned against the rail again, watching. "You sense it too," he said quietly. Over the next few days, tension settled over the ranch like a thin layer of dust that would not shake loose. Nothing dramatic happened. No fences were torn down, no animals vanished, but signs kept appearing. A shallow print near the water trough one morning, a patch of trampled grass near the far edge of the property. Once, just before dawn, the rancher thought he saw a shape on the ridge above the cottonwoods, still and upright against the sky. When he blinked, it was gone. The dark bay grew more alert with each passing night. It slept less, it circled the herd more often. When the other horses grazed, it kept its head high. The rancher began spending more time near the north pasture, sometimes even camping out by the fence with a small fire and a blanket. He told the hands it was caution. In truth, he wanted to see for himself what moved out there after dark. One evening, as the sky turned deep blue and the first stars showed, one of the older hands joined him by the fence. "You think it is just a stray animal?" the man asked. "I have seen plenty of strays," the rancher replied. "They do not linger like this." "Then what?" The rancher took a slow breath. "Could be someone scouting. Could be a neighbor looking to push boundaries." The older man frowned. "That land beyond the creek has been empty for years. Empty land still draws attention. Money was tight across the county. Drought did not spare anyone. There had been rumors at the last supply run that outside buyers were eyeing ranch properties. Developers, some said. Others claimed cattle barons from farther west were looking to expand. If someone wanted this land, testing the fences would be one way to start. The older hand shifted uneasily. "You think they would spook the herd on purpose?" "I think people will do what they believe they can get away with." Silence fell between them. The fire crackled low. Out in the pasture, the dark bay stood facing the creek again. Near midnight, a sound drifted across the land. Not loud, not sharp. A long, low call that rose and fell in a strange rhythm. The rancher sat up straight. It was not the sharp yip of a coyote, not the steady howl of a wolf either. It carried something deeper, almost mournful. The herd reacted at once, heads snapped up. Bodies pressed closer together. The dark bay moved to the front, placing itself between the herd and the tree line. The rancher stood and stepped away from the fire, letting his eyes adjust to the dark. The moon cast a pale glow over the pasture. Shadows stretched long and thin. There, near the cottonwoods, he saw movement. This time it was clear, a horse, tall and lean, coat pale in the moonlight. It stood just beyond the fence, still as stone. The rancher's breath caught. It was not one of his. He knew each shape in that pasture now. This horse stood alone outside the boundary, watching the herd inside. The dark bay let out a low, warning nicker. The pale horse lifted its head slightly, ears forward. For several long seconds, nothing moved. Then the pale horse turned and stepped back into the trees, disappearing without a sound. The rancher remained frozen in place. A stray horse wandering this far was unusual but not impossible. Yet the timing, the storm, the broken fence, the tracks, it did not feel random. Behind him, one of the hands whispered, "You saw it too." "Yes. Should we track it at first light?" The rancher nodded slowly. "We will." Morning came heavy with anticipation. The men saddled up early. The rancher led them toward the creek where the pale horse had stood. Fresh tracks marked the damp earth outside the fence. They were clear in daylight. Larger than the previous prints he had found, strong and deliberate. They followed the trail across the shallow creek and into the brush beyond. The path wound upward toward the rocky hills. As they rode, the rancher felt a growing sense that this was more than a stray. The pale horse had not tried to break in. It had not bolted at their presence. It had come close, watched, and left. Halfway up the ridge, they found something that tightened the knot in his chest. An old branding mark carved into a weathered tree trunk. It was faint, cut years ago. But he recognized the symbol, a simple curved line crossing a straight bar. It belonged to a ranch that had shut down nearly a decade earlier after a fire wiped out its main barn. The owner had left the county without much word. "Why would that mark be up here?" one of the younger men asked. The rancher did not answer right away. He remembered that fire, remembered the rumors that followed. Some said it was lightning, others whispered about debts and disputes. He had known the former owner well enough to share a few cattle drives. A proud man, stubborn, quick to defend his land. The rancher looked at the tracks again. They continued past the marked tree and into a narrow draw between the rocks. "We go no farther today," he said at last. "Why not?" The younger hand pressed. "Because I want to understand before we step deeper." They turned back toward home, though the question lingered in every mind. Back at the ranch, the dark bay stood waiting near the fence as if it had known where they had gone. When the rancher dismounted, the horse stepped closer than it ever had before, stopping only a few feet away. He reached out slowly this time. His hand hovered near the horse's neck. The dark bay did not flinch. For the first time, his fingers brushed its coat, warm and solid beneath his touch. "You know something," he murmured. The horse's skin twitched under his hand, but it did not pull away. That evening, another subplot began to unfold inside the ranch house. The rancher spread old maps across the table, tracing property lines by lamplight. He studied records he had not opened in years, deeds, old sale agreements, notes about neighboring parcels long forgotten. One boundary line near the creek caught his eye. It shifted slightly in the older map compared to the newer survey, just enough to matter. If someone believed the line sat a few yards farther in, it could give them claim to water access during drought. Water meant survival. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Was the pale horse a signal? A way to unsettle his herd and push him to move them farther from the creek? Outside, the wind picked up again, though no storm followed. In the north pasture, the dark bay stood beneath the moon, watching the tree line. Far beyond the cottonwoods, on the ridge where the old branding mark scarred the trunk, a pale shape appeared once more. It stood high above the ranch, quiet and patient. The land felt smaller now, tighter somehow. And as the rancher extinguished the lamp and stepped out onto the porch, he sensed that whatever was unfolding out there was not only about horses or fences. It was about territory, about history, about something left unfinished. The dark bay lifted its head at the same moment he did, both of them staring toward the hills. The pale horse did not move. It simply watched. The pale horse stayed on the ridge until the moon dipped low, a quiet shape against the sky. The rancho did not sleep that night. He stood on the porch long after the lamps inside had gone dark, arms resting on the rail, eyes fixed on the hills beyond the cottonwoods. The dark bay mirrored him from the pasture, both of them watching the same horizon, as if tied by something neither fully understood. By morning, a decision had settled in the rancher's chest. Waiting was no longer enough. Whatever was circling his land, whether stray horse, rival rancher, or old claim rising from the past, had grown bold. The broken fence, the night calls, the pale shape at the boundary, these were not accidents. They were signals. He called the hands together again, this time not just to check fences. "We ride the ridge today," he said, voice steady. "We find out what is moving out there." The younger men exchanged glances, a mix of nerves and curiosity. The older hand gave a slow nod. No one argued. Before they saddled up, the rancher walked to the north pasture. The dark bay stood near the fence, already alert. It stepped forward when he approached, ears tipped toward him. He did not reach for a rope. He did not try to corner it. Instead, he opened the gate. The other horses lifted their heads but did not rush. The dark bay remained still, watching him closely. "If you are going to guard this herd," he said quietly, "then you should see what we see." He stepped back from the gate and turned toward the barn. The dark bay hesitated only a moment before following at a slow walk. It did not bolt. It did not shy away. It walked beside him, not tamed, not broken, but choosing to stay. The men froze when they saw the horse move through the yard without halter or rope. "You sure about this?" one asked. "No," the rancher answered honestly. "But I trust him." They mounted up and rode toward the creek, the dark bay trailing slightly behind at first. As they crossed the shallow water and began climbing toward the ridge, the horse quickened its pace, drawing even with the rancher's mount. The land beyond the cottonwoods felt different in daylight. The rocks were sharper, the brush thicker. Wind carried a faint scent of something unfamiliar, like distant smoke or damp earth turned recently. They found fresh tracks again, deeper this time, and not only of a single horse. 2 sets, maybe 3. They overlapped in places, circling near the narrow draw where they had turned back before. The rancher raised a hand, signaling the others to slow. "There," the younger hand whispered. At the edge of the ridge, just beyond the draw, stood the pale horse. In full daylight, its coat shone almost silver, its mane hung long and untamed. It did not appear thin or starved, it looked strong, well kept in its own way. And it was not alone. 2 more horses stood behind it, darker in color but just as steady. They did not scatter at the sight of riders. They watched. The dark bay stepped forward, muscles tightening beneath its coat. It did not charge, it did not rear. It stood tall, facing the pale horse across a stretch of rocky ground. The rancher felt a pulse of tension move through both groups. This was no random meeting. The 2 lead horses stood like mirrors, each guarding what was behind them. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the pale horse let out a low call, deep and steady. The sound carried across the ridge. The dark bay responded with a sharp, clear whinny. The rancher's grip tightened on his reins. He had seen horses challenge each other before, but this was different. There was no rush to clash, no wild display. It felt almost like conversation. One of the men shifted in his saddle. "You think they are from that old ranch?" "Could be," the rancher said quietly. The pale horse took a few steps forward, slow and careful. The darker horses behind it held position. The dark bay matched the movement, stepping closer to the ridge edge. The rancher sensed the balance hanging by a thread. If either horse misread the other, the herd below could be drawn into panic again. And if these ridge horses were part of someone else's plan, this could be the moment that plan unfolded. A sudden gust of wind swept across the ridge, carrying dust and loose gravel. The horses flinched but held their ground. Then from farther up the ridge, beyond the visible line of rock, came another sound. A gate creaking, not the natural groan of wood in wind. A metal hinge shifting under weight. Every rider on the ridge turned toward the sound. There, partly hidden by brush, stood a section of fencing that had not been visible from below, old but intact. A narrow holding pen carved into the slope itself, and near it, a figure. A man stood half in shadow, hat low, arms folded. He did not wave, he did not call out. He simply watched the standoff between the horses and the riders. The rancher felt a slow heat rise in his chest. This was no accident. Someone had been working this ridge quietly. Someone had placed horses here, close enough to stir his herd but far enough to deny blame. The dark bay sensed the shift in tension. It moved closer to the rancher, almost brushing against his leg. He rested a hand lightly against its neck without thinking. The pale horse turned its head slightly toward the shadowed figure, then back toward the dark bay, as if waiting for a signal. The rancher nudged his mount forward a few steps. "You planning to say something?" he called out, voice carrying across the open ground. The figure did not answer right away. Instead, he stepped forward into clearer view, an older man, weathered face, eyes sharp despite the years. Recognition struck the rancher like a sudden jolt. The former owner of the burned ranch. "I thought you left," the rancher said. "I did," the man replied evenly. "For a time," the wind shifted again, tugging at coats and manes. "You are testing my fences," the rancher continued. "I am testing boundaries," the man corrected. The younger hands exchanged uneasy looks. This was no simple stray horse. This was a land dispute rising from old ashes. "You know that creek line is mine," the rancher said. "It was not always," the other man answered. Silence settled between them, heavy and charged. The pale horse stamped once against the rocky soil. The dark bay lifted its head higher. The former owner's gaze moved to the dark bay. "That one of yours?" "He chose to be," the rancher said. A faint smile touched the older man's mouth. "Strong lead. So is yours." The two horses stood almost nose to nose now, separated by only a few yards of open rock. Neither showed fear. "You drove them hard in the canyon," the older man said. "I watched. You were there," the rancher replied. "I have been watching longer than you think." The admission tightened the air even further. Below the ridge, the rancher's herd could be seen in the distance, scattered across the north pasture. If a chase began here, if these ridge horses bolted downhill, chaos could spill across both properties. "You could have come to my door," the rancher said. "And said what?" the older man asked quietly. "That I want back what I lost?" The words hung heavy between them. The rancher studied him more closely now. There was pride there still, and something else, regret, maybe, or unfinished business. "You think pushing horses at my fence will change a deed?" the rancher asked. The older man's eyes flicked toward the creek. Water changes everything. The drought had bitten deeper this season. Wells were running lower across the county. If the creek shifted course or dried further, every foot of access would matter. The pale horse took another slow step forward. The dark bay answered with one of its own. The rancher felt the moment building toward something sharp and irreversible. If the horses clashed, if either herd broke and ran, it would not just be about pride anymore. It would be about survival, territory, and control of the land. The older man lifted a hand slightly. The pale horse paused. The rancher did not miss the gesture. These horses were not wild accidents. They were trained to hold ground. To test. "You want to settle this on horseback?" the rancher asked, voice steady but firm. The older man studied him for a long breath. Then from somewhere beyond the ridge, another group of horses moved into view. Not 3 this time, but several. More shapes cresting the hill. The rancher's heart pounded. This was bigger than a single stray or a quiet dispute. This was a herd positioned deliberately above his land. Behind him, one of his own hands shifted nervously. "We are outnumbered up here." The rancher did not look back. The dark bay stepped fully in front of him now, placing itself between the riders and the ridge horses. Its muscles coiled, ready. The pale horse tossed its head once, then stilled again. The wind swept across the ridge in a strong gust, carrying dust between the two sides. For a few seconds, visibility blurred. When the dust cleared, both lead horses stood even closer than before. Nostrils flared, eyes locked. The rancher felt time stretch thin. One wrong move and everything would break loose. The older man's gaze did not waver. "This land remembers," he said quietly. "So do I," the rancher replied. Below them, a section of fence near the creek rattled in the rising wind. The sky above darkened slightly, clouds rolling in from the west, though no storm had been forecast. The dark bay let out a deep, resonant call that echoed across the ridge. The pale horse answered. And in that charged, breathless moment, with two herds poised on the edge of motion and two men bound by history and drought, the first horse shifted its weight forward. The first horse to shift its weight forward was not the pale one. It was the dark bay. For a heartbeat, the rancher thought it would charge. Every muscle in the animal's body tightened, hooves pressing into the rocky soil. The riders behind him braced. The ridge horses lifted their heads. The wind cut across the hill like a blade. But instead of lunging, the dark bay stepped calmly past the rancher and walked straight toward the pale horse. No rush, no pinned ears, no flashing teeth. Just a steady walk. The pale horse held its ground. The older man did not raise his hand again. He simply watched, jaw tight. The two horses met at the center of the ridge. They stood close enough that their breath mingled in the cooling air, nostrils flared. Ears flicked. The tension that had coiled so tight seemed to gather at that single point between them. Then the dark bay lowered its head, not in defeat, not in fear, in acknowledgement. The pale horse hesitated, then lowered its head as well. The rancher let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Around him, the men shifted in their saddles, confusion giving way to cautious relief. The dark bay stepped to the side, not blocking the path, not challenging for dominance. It simply stood strong and steady. The pale horse glanced back toward the small herd behind it. They did not surge forward. They did not scatter. They waited. The older man finally spoke, his voice quieter now. They know each other, the rancher nodded slowly. Horses remember. The older man looked out over the ridge toward the creek and the north pasture beyond. His gaze lingered on the water line that had become the center of their silent battle. When my barn burned, he said, I lost more than buildings. I lost breeding stock, lost bloodlines I had worked 20 years to shape. I thought if I could rebuild even a small herd up here, near the old boundary, maybe I could claim something back. The rancher listened without interrupting. I did not come to steal, the older man continued. I came to test whether this land still held room for me. And pushing my fences? The rancher asked. I needed to see if you would run, the man admitted. The rancher gave a faint, humorless smile. I do not run. That is why I am here. Below them, the creek glinted under a break in the clouds. The drought had narrowed it, but it still moved, still offered life. The dark bay nudged the pale horse lightly. The pale horse answered with a small toss of its mane. No clash, no fight. The rancher studied the ridge herd more closely now. They were strong animals, not wild strays, not thieves' stock. Carefully raised, even if handled quietly. You set up that pen in the draw? The rancher said. Yes. You carved your old brand into the tree. Yes. To remind yourself? To remind the land? The older man replied. Silence stretched again, but it felt different this time, not sharp. Not ready to snap, the rancher looked back toward his own men. They waited for his lead. He thought of the map spread across his kitchen table. The boundary line that had shifted slightly between old and new surveys, the drought tightening across the county. The cost of pride when water ran low. He thought of the dark bay standing through the storm, guarding the herd. He thought of the pale horse waiting on the ridge night after night, not charging, not breaking in, just watching. The conflict had never truly been about horses alone. It had been about land, history, and the fear of losing what a man had built with his hands. He nudged his mount forward until he was only a few yards from the older man. You want water access? He said plainly. I want a chance to rebuild, the older man answered. You chose a hard way to ask. So did you when you bought that herd, the man replied. The rancher could not argue that. Below them, a section of his own herd had begun drifting closer to the ridge, drawn by the presence of the other horses. They were not panicked, curious more than anything. The dark bay stood between both groups, steady as a fence post. An idea formed slowly in the rancher's mind, risky, uncertain, but strong. You said this land remembers, he said. Then maybe it remembers when neighbors work together instead of against each other. The older man studied him carefully. What are you saying? I'm saying the creek runs along both sides of that boundary. If the drought worsens, neither of us can afford to fight over inches of dirt. The wind eased slightly, as if waiting for the next words. We can redraw the working line, the rancher continued. Not the deed, the working line. Shared access at the bend where the water pool's deepest. Fences adjusted so neither herd feels trapped. The younger hands behind him stiffened. This was not what they had expected. You would do that? The older man asked, surprise clear in his voice. I would rather build something steady than spend years chasing each other's shadows. The older man looked at the pale horse, then at the ridge herd behind him. His jaw tightened as if wrestling with pride. And in return? He asked carefully. In return, the rancher said, we stop testing fences. We stop circling each other in the dark. We run cattle drives together when needed. We share storm warnings. We keep this land strong instead of splitting it thin. The older man was quiet for a long time. Below them, the two lead horses moved even closer. The dark bay brushed its shoulder lightly against the pale horse. The gesture carried no aggression. It felt almost like recognition. The older man finally removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair. You are asking me to trust you. The rancher met his gaze. I already trusted you once. I just did not know it. A faint crease appeared at the corner of the older man's eyes. Not quite a smile, but close. You always were stubborn, he said. So were you. Another gust of wind swept the ridge, but this time it felt warmer, carrying the scent of dry grass instead of tension. The older man stepped forward, extending his hand. The rancher dismounted. For a moment they stood face to face on the ridge where confrontation had nearly erupted. Years of history, pride, and silence hung between them. Then they shook hands. It was not dramatic, no grand speeches. Just two weathered grips locking in agreement. Behind them, the younger riders relaxed visibly. The pale horse turned and began walking back toward the ridge pen. The darker horses followed without resistance. The dark bay watched them go, ears forward, then turned and walked back toward the rancher. It stopped beside him, head high. You see? The rancher murmured softly. No need to fight. The older man studied the dark bay closely. That horse chose you? Feels more like I chose him, the rancher replied. Either way, you were right to take all those horses. The rancher let out a small breath of laughter. No one expected what one of them would do next. They walked together down from the ridge, side by side, talking through practical details. Where to shift the fence. How to clear a shared watering point. When to bring both herds together slowly so they would not panic at each other's scent. By the time they reached the creek, the sun had broken fully through the clouds. Light spilled across the water, catching on ripples and turning them bright. The men began measuring ground with boots and glances, already planning posts and wire. In the north pasture, the herd had settled again. The tension that had hovered for weeks seemed to lift like dust after rain. The rancher rested his hand on the dark bay's neck. The horse leaned into the touch slightly, no longer wary. You guarded more than fences, he said quietly. You guarded sense. Over the next weeks, the work was steady but peaceful. The boundary fence shifted a few yards where it made sense. A shared gate was built near the deepest bend of the creek. Both herds were introduced gradually, first across distance, then closer, until the sight of one another no longer stirred alarm. The pale horse and the dark bay often stood near that shared line, no longer as rivals but as quiet sentinels. Word spread through the county that two stubborn ranchers had found common ground instead of dragging each other through court or conflict. Some were surprised. Others took notes. The drought did not vanish overnight, but the shared water held strong enough for both operations to survive. When a late summer storm finally rolled through, it brought more rain than expected. The creek swelled gently, filling the bend that had once threatened division. One evening, as the sun set gold over the plains, the rancher stood by the fence once more. The herd grazed calmly. The dark bay moved among them with confidence, no longer restless, no longer scanning the tree line with suspicion. Beyond the creek, the pale horse grazed near its own herd, lifting its head now and then, but without tension. The rancher felt something settle deep inside him. He had stepped into conflict expecting a fight. Instead, he had found partnership. He had taken all those horses believing he needed strength. What he gained was something steadier, trust. He glanced at the dark bay and smiled faintly. Turns out, he said under his breath, the strongest thing on this ranch was never the fence. The wind moved softly through the grass. The land felt wide again. Open, not divided. And as twilight wrapped around the ranch, man and horse stood easy under the fading light.